The autumn of 1847 settled over Ashfield Manor the way debt always did, quietly at first and then all at once. Leonora Ashfield had grown accustomed to quiet. At 26, she had become the kind of woman a house relies upon without acknowledging. She knew which floorboard in the east corridor groaned if stepped on too firmly, and which chimney in the upstairs sitting room drew poorly in a northerly wind. She knew that cook's rheumatism was worse on damp mornings, and that the cellar had been leaking since April. She knew all of this because she had been paying attention for years. The way people pay attention when no one is paying attention to them. The manor sat in the grey hills of Northumberland, handsome at a distance, and revealing its troubles only up close, the moss creeping into the mortar. The drawing-room curtains bleached pale by a decade of sun, the silver that had been quietly disappearing from the sideboard one piece at a time. Her father, Sir Aldous Ashfield, was a man of considerable charm and considerable negligence, and the combination had slowly undone them. She was mending a curtain hem when he found her that Tuesday morning in October, and the look on his face told her something had shifted. "We are to have a visitor," he said, standing in the doorway with his coat on and his hat already in his hands, which meant he intended to leave shortly after delivering whatever news required her compliance. "A gentleman from Edinburgh, a Mr. Vane." Leonora set down her needle. "When?" "This evening." He cleared his throat. "He arrives this evening." She understood then that the visit was not precisely a social call. Men of business did not travel from Edinburgh on a Tuesday to take dinner in a struggling manor house out of mere curiosity. They came to inspect. They came to calculate, she asked. "What does he want with the estate?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Her father turned his hat in his hands to discuss its future. That was how Sir Aldous Ashfield spoke when he did not wish to say anything plainly. Leonora had been interpreting him her entire life. She excused herself from the parlour and went upstairs to look at her wardrobe. There was not much to consider. The black bombazine she had worn to her mother's funeral 6 years ago, the russet merino that was beginning to pill at the elbows, and the pewter grey wool, plain and well cut, but so familiar by now that it had ceased to have any quality beyond utility. She took it down. It was honest at least. It did not pretend to be something it was not, and neither did she. Mr. Vane's carriage arrived as the last of the daylight was draining from the hills. It was not a showy vehicle. No crests, no excessive lacework on the wheels, but it was built for endurance, the horses well matched and in excellent condition. A man who kept his horses well, Leonora had long believed, could generally be trusted not to be entirely careless about the things in his care. She watched from the upper landing as her father went to the door. The man who entered was not what she had pictured. She had imagined someone older, florid, with the comfortable self-importance of a creditor who has grown used to other people's discomfort. This man was perhaps 35, lean and dark-coated, with a stillness about him that had nothing to do with reticence and everything to do with patience. He did not look around the entrance hall the way assessors did. The quick, acquisitive sweep that priced everything in the room. He simply handed his coat to Briggs and turned as her father began to speak. When she descended the stairs, he looked up. His eyes were a dark, complicated shade of brown, the colour of river water over stone in autumn. They moved over her with the same quiet attention he seemed to give everything, and then he inclined his head in a brief, formal gesture. Mr. Vane, she curtsied, small and unhurried. Dinner was a negotiation of silences. Her father talked about the autumn harvest, which had been middling, about the tenants, 3 of whom were behind on their rents, about the drainage problem in the lower fields that had been a drainage problem for as long as anyone could remember. Mr. Vane listened. He asked occasional questions, precise and undecorated, and her father answered them with a man's habit of revealing more than he intended. He addressed her once. "Do you manage the household accounts yourself, Miss Ashfield?" She looked at him squarely. "I have done, for the past 4 years, and—" "The kitchen garden, since my mother died?" Yes, he considered this. He did not say it was admirable or unusual or sad. He simply nodded as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected, and returned to his soup. After dinner, her father insisted on showing their guest the billiard room, which still had all its furniture and was therefore Ashfield Manor's most impressive space. Leonora excused herself. She went not to the sitting room, but to her mother's old study. At the end of the west corridor, the small cold room that smelled of old paper and dried lavender, where the household ledgers lived, and where she had spent more evenings than she could count, trying to make numbers behave the way she needed them to. She did not hear him follow. "I thought I heard footsteps in this direction, Mr. Vane said from the doorway, his tone neither apologetic nor intrusive. "I excused myself from the billiard room. Your father is an excellent talker." "He is," she said. A pause. He looked at the ledgers open on the desk, at her ink-stained fingers, at the single candle she had lit. He did not comment on any of it. "Miss Ashfield," he said. "May I speak plainly?" She looked at him. "I would prefer it." He came into the room then, stopped a few feet from the desk, and folded his hands behind his back in the manner of a man who thinks more clearly when he is standing still. "Your father's debts," he said, "are considerable, more considerable than he has represented to you, I suspect, though you have guessed at the extent of it." He paused. "The estate is mortgaged to within a season of being unrecoverable. By spring, without intervention, it will need to be sold." Leonora did not flinch. She had known the shape of this, if not the precise dimensions. Knowing does not, however, make hearing it any easier. She kept her hands flat on the desk. "And your interest in it," she said, "is what exactly?" His expression did not change, but something shifted in it. "My name is not Vane," he said. "That is the name I use when I do not wish to arrive somewhere with an audience. My name is Gideon Colburn. I am the Earl of Strath." The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the west wing, a shutter was loose in the wind, knocking in its frame. "I see," she said. She understood immediately. Not a creditor. Something else entirely. A man with a title and an estate that required a countess, and no particular interest in the theatre of a London courtship. She understood the arithmetic of it with a clarity that was, she found, more steadying than she might have expected. It was a transaction. She was good with those. "My father told you to propose," she said. "It was not a question." "Your father told me you existed," he said, with the faintest note of dryness. The rest was my own conclusion. She stood. She went to the window and looked out at the dark hills, at the lights of the home farm, just visible in the distance. She thought of her mother, who had loved this house even as it wore her down. She thought of Cook's rheumatism and Briggs's failing eyesight, and the 3 families in the South Cottages who had worked this land for 2 generations. She turned around. "I will agree," she said, "on 2 conditions." He waited. "My father is to receive a modest, fixed income administered by your man of business. He is not to be given a lump sum. He will spend it." She said it without apology or softness, because it was simply true. "That is the first, and the second, I will run your household," she said, "not as a decoration, not as a guest in my own rooms. I will manage your estates with the same attention I have given this one, and I will be consulted on matters that affect the people who depend upon you. I am not interested in being an ornament, my lord. I am interested in being useful." The silence stretched. He was looking at her with an expression she could not yet read. Assessment, yes. Something else beneath it. "You are not what I expected," he said at last. No one in my position generally is, she replied. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. It was not quite a smile. Very well, he said. Your conditions are accepted. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was measured and sure, and he released her hand before she had time to feel uncertain about giving it. They were married 10 days later, in the parish church at Claverton, in a ceremony, attended by her father's elderly spaniel, who wandered in uninvited, and Mrs. Greer, who had been her mother's closest friend and wept throughout. The Earl of Strath stood at the altar with the composure of a man signing a business document, and Leonora stood beside him in her pewter-grey wool, because it was warm and honest, and she could not think of a better reason to wear anything else. She did not look back as the carriage passed through the gates of Ashfield Manor. There was no point. Forward was the only direction available. Strathmore Court was in Perthshire, and it was the most intimidating building she had ever stood beneath. 4 stories of pale granite rising from a sweep of parkland, the kind of house that had been added to by successive generations, each of whom had been determined to make their mark, so that the result was grand and sprawling and slightly contradictory, a Tudor wing grafted onto a Georgian facade at the eastern end that seemed to have arrived in the night and refused to leave. It was magnificent and impersonal, like a museum that had forgotten what it was housing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dunbar, received her with the precise, evaluating courtesy of a woman who has served the same household for 30 years and considers it hers by rights. Her gaze moved over Leonora's plain dress, her single modest trunk, her lack of a travelling maid, and communicated no opinion whatsoever, which was somehow worse than disapproval. The rooms they gave her in the south wing were beautiful. Silk-hung walls, carpets deep as meadow grass, a fire already lit. A view of the walled garden through leaded windows. They were also absolutely impersonal, as though prepared for the arrival of a guest expected to stay briefly. She dined alone for the first 3 evenings. Lord Strath, she could not yet call him by his given name. It would have felt presumptuous, like moving furniture in someone else's house. Was in Edinburgh on estate business, she was told. His absence felt neither deliberate nor accidental. It felt simply like the way things were. She began, in those first quiet days, to learn Strathmore Court the way she had once learned Ashfield Manor, not from the rooms that had been prepared for her, but from the rooms that had been forgotten. She walked its corridors in the early mornings, learning which windows stuck and which fires smoked, and how the kitchens were organized, and what Mrs. Dunbar did well, and what she had stopped noticing, because she had done it the same way. For 30 years, she found the library on the 3rd day. It occupied most of the first floor's north wing, and had been, she suspected, the true heart of the house before that heart had stopped. Books from floor to ceiling, 3 rolling ladders, a fireplace that drew beautifully, and 2 armchairs positioned near the window with the air of objects that had once been used often and had been waiting ever since. The collection was extraordinary. Natural philosophy, history, estate management, horticulture, law. She began at the horticulture section and worked her way through it slowly, with the focused pleasure of someone drinking water after a long thirst. Lord Strath found her there on a Thursday morning, 10 days after her arrival. She heard the door open and looked up. He had returned the previous evening. She had been informed by the young housemaid, who brought her morning tea. He looked, in the library's grey morning light, neither warmer nor colder than he had in Northumberland. He looked like a man who had a great deal to attend to, and was uncertain how to account for her in the accounting. "You are in my library," he said. It was not an accusation. "You have an extraordinary one," she replied. "Your grandmother's. Judging by the inscriptions," she annotated generously. Something moved in his expression. "She did," he said after a moment. She ran this estate for 11 years after my grandfather died. The margins of the agricultural texts were her particular contribution to scholarship. He walked into the room, came to stand near the shelves, looked at the volume in her hands. She tilted it so he could read the spine. He did not comment on the subject matter. The management of sheep pastures on difficult terrain, but she thought he had not expected it. "Mrs. Dunbar tells me you have been asking for the household accounts," he said. "I have. She has not yet produced them. She will." He paused. "She is not accustomed to change." "Neither am I," Leonora said, "but it is generally better than the alternative." He looked at her, that same quiet, calculating regard. "You said you wish to be useful." "I do." The walled garden has been under the care of a single elderly under-gardener for the past 2 years. Our head gardener retired in the spring and has not been replaced. The kitchen productivity has dropped considerably. She closed the book. "Show me." He blinked. It was, she thought, the first genuine flicker of surprise she had seen from him. They walked the walled garden together that afternoon in the thin autumn sunlight, and she asked questions and he answered them, and she pointed to things and named them and explained what they needed. And he listened with the attention he seemed to give to everything. Which was to say, total. He did not manage the garden himself. He would not have time, but he knew it. He had grown up in it. She could see that in the way he paused at an ancient quince tree in the south corner, his hand resting briefly against the bark without quite reaching it. "Your grandmother's?" she asked. He looked at the tree. "She planted it the year my father was born," he said. "She claimed it produced the finest jelly in Perthshire and defied anyone to contradict her. Was she right?" "Almost." "Certainly." A pause. She was right about most things. It was the most he had said about himself that was not related to business or management. Leonora stored it carefully. "I should like to hire a new head gardener," she said. "In spring, the garden can be productive again. The kitchen will benefit, and the kitchen garden is good for morale. People feel better in a house that grows things." He looked at her sideways. "You believe a kitchen garden affects morale. I believe a house that feels cared for tells the people in it that they are worth caring for," she said. "Yes." He was quiet. For a moment. "My mother died when I was 9, he said. "My father died 4 years after her. This house has been run efficiently since then. But you are correct that it has not, perhaps, been run warmly." She did not fill the silence that followed. It was not a silence that needed filling. His grandmother arrived from Inverness 3 weeks later, and Leonora understood immediately why the old woman was described by the staff of terror, with a combination of deep affection and mild terror. "You, Lady Dorothea Colborne," a name Leonora recognized from the file of names she was not to use, but this was a different Dorothea. The Earl's grandmother, not a prior character, so she kept her, was a woman of 72 who swept into Strathmore Court as though she had simply been delayed, not absent for months. She took in the walled garden, the reorganized kitchens. The new girl Leonora had promoted to assist Mrs. Dunbar, and the arrangement of the dining room table. Leonora had replaced the vast mahogany expanse that sat 20 with a smaller oval that sat 6 comfortably, and then she looked at Leonora with eyes sharp as glass. "You're the one who moved the table," she said. "I am," Leonora said. "Good." It was absurd. Gideon rattling around at one end like a marble in a barrel. She studied her. "You're not frightened of him." "I am not." "Excellent. Everyone is frightened of Gideon, which is terribly inconvenient for all parties. Come with me. I want to see what you've done in the still room." They spent 3 hours in the still room, and the kitchen, and the linen room. And at the end of it, Lady Dorothea declared that Leonora had better instincts than the last 3 housekeepers combined, and that the household had been suffering from a severe shortage of common sense for a decade. It was, Leonora gathered, the highest possible compliment. That evening she passed Lord Strath, Gideon, in the corridor outside the library. He paused. "My grandmother approves of you," he said. "She is remarkably perceptive." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "She is. She told me you reorganized the preserves by season rather than size. She has been trying to get Mrs. Dunbar to do that for 15 years. Leonora said nothing, but she could feel the warmth in her chest, small and careful. It was after that things began to change, in the way that significant things often change, not dramatically, but by accumulation. He began to appear in the library when she was there, not seeking her out precisely, but not avoiding her either. He would read at one end of the room and she at the other, and gradually the distance between their chairs diminished, a few inches at a time, until one evening she looked up and he was seated across from her entirely, close enough that she could see the ink stain on his forefinger, which meant he had been writing letters and had not noticed it. They talked, not in the way of people making conversation, but in the way of people who had found, to their own surprise, that conversation was worthwhile. He asked about Ashfield, about her mother, about the years of managing a household that was quietly losing ground. She told him the truth, plainly and without apology, because plain truth was the only currency she had ever found reliable. He told her about Edinburgh, about the legislation he was attempting to push through Parliament regarding tenant protections in the Highlands, about his grandmother's quince jelly, which had indeed been the finest in Perthshire. One evening he was working late in the study at the end of the east corridor, the light visible under the door when she passed on her way to bed. She hesitated. She went to the kitchen and came back with a pot of tea and 2 cups. She knocked once, softly, and when he said, "Come in," she pushed the door open. He was at his desk, papers arranged in the methodical, interlocking pattern of a man who thinks in systems. He looked up. She set the tray on the edge of his desk and poured without asking. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice quieter than usual, as people's voices are late at night when the house is settled. "I know," she said. She set his cup beside his hand. "Good night, my lord." "Gideon," he said. She paused at the door. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen there before. Something unguarded, something that had come through the careful exterior he maintained as effortlessly as she maintained her own. "Gideon," she said, and the name in her mouth felt less like a concession and more like an opening. She did not sleep for some time after that. She lay in the silk-hung room, listening to the autumn wind move through the Perthshire hills, and tried to identify what she was feeling, because she had learned long ago that unidentified feelings had a way of making decisions without you. She was not unhappy. She was, in fact, something almost the reverse, and the realization was alarming in the way that unexpected things are alarming. Not because they are bad, but because they require a rearrangement of all your other certainties. She had come here to be useful. She had not planned on anything else. Spring found Strathmore Court changed. The walled garden was breathing again under the supervision of a new head gardener, a methodical young man from Aberdeenshire, who understood both drainage and Leonora's directional silences. The kitchen was productive, the still room full, the household accounts balanced in ways they had not been in years. Mrs. Dunbar had, cautiously and by small degrees, begun to trust her. London came at Lady Dorothea's insistence, and it arrived with considerable force. Strathmore House in the new town was another magnitude of grandeur entirely, and Edinburgh society had been anticipating the Earl's new countess with the particular alertness of people who have not had something to discuss in several weeks. The news of a quiet country marriage to an obscure Northumberland baronet's daughter, had apparently been circulating since November. Leonora went prepared. Lady Dorothea had taken her wardrobe in hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who knows what a battle requires and does not believe in fighting it. Badly equipped, they had ordered gowns in the understated colors that suited her. Deep sage, charcoal silk, one gown in ivory that was so simply cut. It stopped being simple and became something else. Entirely. You do not need to outshine them, Lady Dorothea had told her. You simply need to be entirely yourself while they are performing. The contrast will be sufficient. The performance, when it came in the form of Lady Sylvia Pemberton, who had been the acknowledged beauty of the Edinburgh season for 2 consecutive years, and whose family had made no secret of their expectations regarding the Earl of Strath. She had copper hair, green eyes, a fortune, and a smile that had been engineered to arrive precisely where it could do the most damage. They were at the Caledonian Society's autumn reception when Lady Pemberton materialized at Gideon's elbow. "Lord Strath," she said, her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who wishes to appear warm without the inconvenience of actually being so. "How wonderful to see you returned to civilization." Her gaze found Leonora with the careful precision of a needle finding its mark. "And your wife. We have been so curious." "Lady Pemberton," Leonora said before Gideon could speak. Her voice was perfectly level. "How kind. I find Edinburgh very fine. Though I confess I have spent more of my time in the libraries than in society. The collection at the Advocates' Library is remarkable. Have you visited recently?" Lady Pemberton had not. One could see this immediately. "I prefer livelier pursuits," she said. "Of course," Leonora agreed, with the mildest possible smile. "We each suit ourselves to what we do best." There was a brief, crystalline silence. Gideon's hand came to the small of her back, a quiet, certain pressure. Lady Pemberton moved on, her smile no longer engineered for warmth. The weeks that followed were navigated much as Leonora had expected, with patience, consistency, and the particular quality of not appearing to notice what was intended to wound. Lady Pemberton's circle deployed the social arsenal of the well-connected. Whispers about the Ashfield family's finances, pointed inquiries about the absence of a dowry, a habit of turning their backs when Leonora entered a room. Leonora continued to attend the lectures at the Royal Society that she had been finding genuinely engrossing, continued to pursue the small circle of thoughtful, curious people she had discovered in the margins of Edinburgh society, and continued to run Strathmore House with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. What she did not do was tell Gideon. He was observant enough to see it regardless. One evening after a supper party at which the coldness directed toward her had been particularly studied, he closed the door of the carriage and sat for a long moment in the London-lit dark. "You should have told me," he said. "There was nothing to tell that required your attention." "You are my wife," he said. "What concerns you concerns me." He paused, and the carriage moved off through the lamplit streets. "That is not merely a formal statement." She looked at him. The candlelight was moving across his face, and he was looking back at her with an expression that had become familiar to her over these months, the expression of a man who is arriving somewhere he did not plan on going and is not sure whether to be alarmed or relieved. "I know," she said quietly. There was a dinner the following week, the largest of the season, hosted by the Marquess of Ardmore. Edinburgh's social winter reached its peak at these events, and the Straths were expected. Leonora had chosen the ivory gown. She had not chosen it for the same reason Lady Pemberton wore sapphires. Not as armor, not as performance. She wore it because it was what she was, and she had decided some time ago that the most effective thing she could do was simply to be it, without apology. Gideon had come to find her before they left. He had stopped in the doorway, She had not noticed him there until he spoke her name. "Leonora." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open, unguarded, startled by its own presence. He crossed the room in 4 even steps and offered his arm, but what he said was quiet and entirely deliberate. "I married you for reasons that were logical and convenient," he said. "I find that they have become entirely irrelevant." She placed her hand on his arm and looked up at him. "Irrelevant," she repeated. "They've been replaced," he said, his voice low, "by reasons I did not anticipate and am not certain I can be suitably articulate about. But I want you to know that this house and my life in it are entirely different because of you. And I am grateful, which is not the word I want, but I am still working on the right one." "You have time," she said. "I intend to make use of it," he said. The evening at Ardmore House was the evening everything shifted. Lady Pemberton had arrived in diamonds and triumph, and she had positioned herself where she could best observe the result of months of careful social erosion. She had, it appeared, expected the result to be visible. It was not. Gideon stayed at Leonora's side the entire evening, not as a statement, not in the manner of a man making a performance of protection, but simply as a man who wished to be where his wife was. He introduced her to people with a warmth she had not heard in his voice before. He disagreed with an elderly general about tenant legislation, while keeping his hand at the small of Leonora's back, and she contributed quietly to the argument, and the general found himself shifting in his position without entirely noticing why. Late in the evening, Lady Pemberton crossed the room with a glass in her hand and a smile that had stopped reaching her eyes. "Lady Strath," she said, "you must find all of this so very different from Northumberland." "Northumberland is very beautiful," Leonora said. "A great deal quieter, certainly. Though I have found that quiet suits me well enough. One hears things more clearly." Lady Pemberton's smile tightened. "Indeed," she said. "Lady Pemberton." Gideon's voice was perfectly courteous, perfectly final, and he employed it the way a door is closed, without drama, without commentary. He turned to Leonora. "I believe they are beginning the music. Will you come?" He led her across the room. The crowd shifted to make way, 'cause crowds do for a man who moves like he is certain of his direction. In the hallway beyond the main room, where the noise dimmed to a murmur, he stopped. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the right word." She waited. "It is not gratitude," he said. "It is not admiration, though it is that as well. It is—" He stopped. He looked at her in the dim hallway light, this woman who had walked into his house in a grey wool dress with a single trunk and proceeded to give the whole thing back its heartbeat. "It is love," he said, with the precision of a man who has finally located the accurate term and intends to be clear about it. "That is the word. I love you, and I would like you to know it plainly, since you have a documented preference for plain speech." Leonora looked at him for a moment. Something had loosened in her chest, something she had been keeping carefully in place since October. "I have developed," she said quietly, "the same preference for you, in case it was not evident." The ghost of a smile. "It was, rather. I was simply making certain." He offered his arm again, and she took it, and they walked back into the room together. Lady Pemberton left early. No one noticed, and the ones who did said nothing, and by the following week there was very little left to say. Summer at Strathmore Court arrived slowly, as summer does in Perthshire, taking its time about it. The walled garden was in full production. The quince tree in the south corner hung heavy with fruit, and the house, stone and sprawling and slightly contradictory, had ceased to feel like a building Leonora was living in, and had become, by some unremarkable daily accumulation, the place she was from. She was sitting one morning on the low wall, beside the kitchen garden, reading the agricultural supplement of the Edinburgh Review when Gideon came to find her. He did not seem surprised to find her precisely where she was, which was a comfort, since she had spent her whole life being precisely where she was, and having people be surprised by it. He sat beside her on the wall. His sleeve was dusty, which meant he had been in the estate office. She noticed, and he noticed her noticing, and neither of them remarked upon it. After a while, he said, "The south pasture drainage is finally resolved." "I know," she said. "I received the report this morning." "Of course you did." A pause that was not uncomfortable. "Mrs. Dunbar has requested a new preserving pot. I have been informed this is your decision." "It is," she said. "She shall have it." He looked sideways at her, at the curve of her profile, at the unself-conscious concentration with which she turned a page. "Leonora," he said. She looked at him. "I am very glad," he said, simply, "that your father is a poor correspondent and sent me that letter." She had not known until this moment that Sir Aldous Ashfield had written to Lord Strathfirst. She would have things to say to her father on his next visit, for now she folded the review closed and set it on the wall between them. "As am I," she said. There was no one watching. There was only the garden and the quince tree and the late summer light doing what light does in Perthshire in July, which is to suggest, without insisting, that things might after all be all right. He put his hand over hers on the rough stone wall, and she turned her hand to meet his, and they sat in the uncomplicated quiet of two people who had arrived somewhere neither of them had expected, and found it, to their considerable mutual surprise, to be exactly where they were meant to be.